Hello. Welcome. My name is Reese, and today we are going to chat about how modern movements embody coherent pluralism. But first, a reminder that this is presented by Root, which is we have a great Root Fellowship, which is a community of world-class systems thinkers looking to understand and build the future. So if you're looking to join the fellowship, check us out at root.co. And again, whoever you are in the world today, I hope you're doing well. I hope you can take some time to enjoy the sun or nature or an animal or a friend. Okay, let's get into it. We're chatting about coherent pluralism, and we're in our second video about this. We already chatted about what is it, and now we're chatting about how some modern movements embody it. And then later we'll chat about how to actually use it in your day-to-day life. So today we're going to talk in two big parts. The first is a zoom out reminder of how our sense making has shifted from the industrial age to the information age. And then we'll get into some of the specific movements, modern movements that actually display coherent pluralism. So first, let's talk about this shift. As a reminder, this is the timeline of humanity in loose terms. The agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, and now the information revolution. And zooming, and when we think of humanity in those big boxes, we can also think of humanity as this networked human organism that is trying to use knowledge, use our sense making to then use energy to move atoms. So we're sense making. We're like, ooh, what do we want to do? Oh, we want to do this. Great. Let's use energy to move atoms to make that happen. And we repeat, and we do that towards a goal, continuing to be a human species. And we just keep doing that little loop. Sense make, output towards a goal. Sense make, output towards a goal. That frame then can be used to apply to the industrial age and specifically how that networked human organism, how it does its sense making and how that changes how it moves in the world. So there's this great quote by Marshall McLuhan, which is he's a famous, information theorist or an understander of how information impacts society. And he says, the medium is the message. And the crucial idea here is imagine if your keyboard looked like this. Well, you might type differently. Or, if you have no printing press, things might be different. If you have a printing press, things are different. If you have the internet, well, that changes the things that get pushed on, it changes the messages that exist. So, Twitter allows 280 characters. That medium of 280 characters changes the messages that get represented on that platform. And so if we think about humanity's shift, especially from the industrial age to the information age, the big shift here was, of course, the printing press in 1440, where we got this printing press. We could create a lot more books, and we did create a lot more books here. And that then led to the scientific revolution. In the 1500s and 1600s, we started to believe things like, wait a second, instead of believing heliocentrism, that the Earth was the center of the universe, we believed in, instead of believing in geocentrism, that the Earth is the center of the universe, we instead believed in heliocentrism, that the sun is the center of our solar system. So not us, but the sun. And these kinds of things, this science as a process really started post-printing press and was a key input for the industrial age. And this process of science has it's gone on for a while now, and now we're getting to some weird places with science. And those places can start to inform how we see science occurring in the information age. So science, after World War II, this is a graph of publications and PhDs and funding, and it's gone up a ton since World War II. This is all in the United States, some of it's the United States, some of it's not. Huge growth in the amount of science, quote unquote, that's being done. But the weird thing is that this is, if you look at the prize-winning discoveries in physics, how important they were. They asked a bunch of physicists to rate them on a scale. Well, when they rated them, most of these discoveries, the 20s, the 1920s were really important. There were some in the 60s that were kind of important, but not that many that recently that have been important. And so the question is, wait, if the funding's gone up so much, why has the discoveries not, kept in pace? Why is this graph not a big, graph up and to the right that's like, wow, we've put so much money towards it and it's working so well? And this is connected to this school of meta-science and trying to understand these sigmoids, these S-curves of, when we started science, how good were we at the beginning? What was the low-hanging fruit? Oh, sweet, things are rocking and rolling. We're going quick on it. We're learning so much about physics. And now it's like, well, are we kind of hitting diminishing returns here? But then maybe we get another sigmoid. And so this process of meta-science is currently occurring, usually under the guise of progress studies is a very connected field here. And this process of science is, getting to the place where we in society are trying to understand how to, what's next with science. And, there's another example here, the replication crisis. The issue here is that studies that have been done that we thought were true, well, in many of them, the percentage of findings that were actually replicated were, 36% of the findings were replicated. And I was like, we believed all these things, and especially in psychology, were they actually true? So this is to say that the printing press kicked off this process of science, was a crucial input to the industrial age, and science has been obviously very amazing for us, but we're starting to hit these weird diminishing returns on it where science itself as a process may be weird and not doing what it's supposed to be doing anymore. In addition to science being both created by the industrial age, but then becoming a little bit weirder these days, the printing press also informed how we created narratives. So the creation of narratives changed post-printing press, and it kind of went from, what I call one-dimensional, hey, here's the truth and nothing but the truth, to these n-dimensional, many-dimensional narratives. And so it started pre-printing press with these one-dimensional handwritten books. Okay, you had the church had a monopoly on the Word of God, and so if you wanted to understand it, well, they controlled all the writing and how to produce more Bibles, and so they had a monopoly on the Word of God. But then the printing press came around, and these things could be propagated. Luther could make something up and then print a lot of copies of it, and that led to Protestantism and the Protestant Reformation, which had all kinds of large impacts. And that Reformation was at this basis of this narrative of is the true thing that God in the Catholic sense, is the bread that you're eating actually God? That's what Catholics believe, I think. And versus Protestantism, which says that the God or the bread that you're eating at church is not actually God, it's metaphorically God. And so that, though, is an example of a new narrative that can be brought up because we have this new n-dimensional way to share them through the printing press. But then we kind of went back to this one-dimensional broadcast situation, like broadcasting instead of narrowcasting. That's what they used to call the things on the internet initially, was being able to narrowcast to different individuals. But broadcasting in the 1900s became this thing where everybody was watching the same TV shows. There were only a couple channels, so everybody was watching them, and there was a couple radio channels, and everybody would hear them. And that broadcast thing was very powerful because it got everybody around some shared narratives, and that allowed people to do things like propaganda, where you say, this is a poster from, I think, World War I in America, where, this brute, this, ape monkey-looking thing is a German soldier. And imagine, when I see this now as an American, I'm like, I'm not into that. But back in the day, maybe this because we had these broadcast systems that were pushing shared narratives onto us, you watched this and you said, okay, I'm going to enlist. I want to beat the other side. So we had this pushback towards this one-dimensional broadcast, and then the web really created this new n-dimensional space where, especially Web 1.0, where just on TCP/IP, oh, man, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Here's a bunch of different Usenet profile or Usenet groups. Anybody can do whatever they want on the internet. It's crazy out there. And then what we've seen now is maybe a little bit of a pushback towards this one-dimensional perspective where the aggregators have aggregated so much stuff onto their platforms, and so maybe we're getting a little bit more coherence instead of pluralism because of the aggregators. So thinking in terms of that, the one-dimensional, n-dimensional media narratives and how that shapes ourselves and the tension between those two, that's kind of a helpful way to view this over time, to view our interaction with coherence versus pluralism over time. And of course, this, with this 1D versus ND thing, the n-dimensional space we're in now is, there's no real shared truths. We're in this post-truth fake news world where there's good info and bad info. So that, I want to say that there is this historical trend is one that, when we think about coherent pluralism as something that individuals do as a response to our new n-dimensional environment, all the information all the time, we should, and as we think about it, especially in terms of science and truth, we should just remind ourselves of those historical pieces for how science started and was created and some of the diminishing returns we're at now, plus how narratives, have been propagated through society and changed by the printing press and other forms of media. Because again, the medium is the message. Okay, what does abundance of information feel like in your body? I felt frustrated or scared of the propaganda. I think propaganda scares me and makes me think of my place in time, where if I was born back in the day, I could have been a slave owner. I could have been a propaganda person. So that, I don't know, that makes me feel weird. Okay, interactive time. What is your perspective on nationalism and propaganda? What identities do you hold, or what propaganda do you kind of believe? Second question, how do you feel like media, do you feel like media is more one-dimensional or n-dimensional or multi-dimensional right now? What should it be? How should we think about a coherence of narrative in society? Okay, now let's chat about how modern movements display coherent pluralism. And there's 5 that I want to chat about here. Metamodernism, and then these Keegan 5 stages, which is a adult development framework, and intersectionality. Those 3 are all very connected to each other. And then we'll chat also about effective altruism and Game B, which are 2 new movements of frontier people that are very connected as well. Okay, starting with metamodernism. So metamodernism is part of this progression through modernism and postmodernism. And modernism, in very loose, high-level terms, is this idea of broadcasting the truth. It's those big one-dimensional broadcast narratives where the country says, believe in America, we will win World War II. And those macro narratives and believing, broadcasting and believing the truth, that's modernism. Postmodernism is really rejecting that and saying, no, we shouldn't believe these narratives, which is true in a variety of ways, but it maybe pushes a bit too far. Postmodernism is very skeptical. Postmodernism has things like fake news, like, we can't believe that. Postmodernism doesn't really believe in a future. Modernism is like, let's keep going for America or for our country. And postmodernism is like, why even care about life? Nothing is real. Metamodernism is, it's this beautiful combination of those 2 things. It is the relationship to that relationship. It's saying, yeah, modernism's not great, but postmodernism's not great. Let's combine them. Let's use the best aspects of both. Let's believe in a beautiful future and come together over shared narratives, while also being pluralistic and, taking into account and rejecting some of them and being skeptical. So that progression is where metamodernism falls. It's in this big, modernism was in kind of the 1800s, but especially early 1900s. Postmodernism is post-World War II generally, both in art but in other ways. And metamodernism is just coming up these days. The term was kind of coined after 2000. So with a specific example here, you can see that modernism might believe this just one-dimensional narrative of, okay, you're consuming from Sean Hannity, coronavirus, it's a hysteria, don't worry about it. And the reason why I use this example is because people who watch Sean Hannity versus another Fox anchor, Tucker Carlson, there were like 25% more deaths, I believe, if you watched Sean Hannity. And then the postmodernism perspective is the fake news, post-truth, nothing's real. There's so much good info, so much bad info, who cares? While the metamodernism perspective actively searches for that good info and searches for it. And this idea of postmodernism, let's understand that a bit better here. It started kind of, as I talked about, like post-World War II, but also with science, where, the structure of scientific revolutions, I think in the 1950s or 60s is when that was written, Thomas Kuhn introduced this idea of paradigms, that, wait a second, science isn't just some kind of true thing that happens. Science is socially constructed. It's based off of the individuals and their biases and how they understand it. And that idea kicked off this big trend towards, wait a second, we don't have to, if science is socially constructed, what is truth? And, you saw some things like the acknowledgement that so much of science was done with weird societies. There's a lot of the social studies research that was done with Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic people. That weird people represented 80% of study participants, a bunch of college students. They were just professors, asking their college students. But that only represents 12% of the world's population. So we're trying to make claims about truth in the world through science, but in fact, we don't recognize that the people we're doing science on there's a small portion of the world. That doesn't really count. Or another example of this, a brilliant example of this is, and sad, is that, the bias of the researchers, that science, the researchers of cars and seatbelts, they only thought about themselves. There was a bunch of males in the room, and so they had their crash dummies, which were all males in a certain height, and then the seatbelts and the airbags and things weren't working as well for females because they were, because the females they were thinking of them in this stupid way because they weren't aware of their own biases, and then females were being more injured in cars as a result. So this was the start of postmodernism in science, to kind of reject this, to understand that the scientific process has our own biases baked within it, and that maybe science and these things are just socially constructed. And that is epitomized today by this debate that happened just a week or two ago around does 2 + 2 = 5? So this is we're at those first postmodernism things were starting in the post-World War II and with paradigms, and then there were these things called the science wars in the 1990s, and then recently on Twitter people were debating, does 2 + 2 = 5? And in some ways this is a great example because this is just a mathematical truth, roughly. And so is this socially constructed or not? What should postmodernism think about this? And on one side, you have this guy, Lee, with I think a relatively reasonable perspective here, kind of the postmodern perspective, which says, hey, 2 + 2 = 5, 2 + 2 = 5, highlights that math has a cultural aspect in choosing your definitions, your conventions, selecting and bundling ideas, communicating them, etc. And then once you choose those things, the deductive and symbolic part of math is pretty neutral. Okay, cool. I think this is reasonable. It's like, well, math does have some cultural aspects to it. In addition to this perspective, again, on this postmodern-ish side, this guy, David Chapman, says, I wrote a similar thing. I wrote about this, that the truth of counting depends on identifying absolutely objectively discrete objects that stay discrete. But no such things exist in physical reality. Clouds aren't countable, and ultimately neither are pebbles or sheep. So it's like, yeah, if you're trying to count how many clouds there are, it's like, well, I don't know, there's maybe 2 over there, maybe 2 over there, so maybe 2 plus 2 kind of equals 4, but depending on how you count them, it kind of equals 5. And similarly with pebbles, like the ones at the bottom here are like, okay, there's a pebble, but then the ones up here, it's like, what counts as a pebble? So, and then Kareem, who is a big part of this conversation, says, okay, imagine a system where we can only, this is again, it's the postmodern perspective, where we can only measure things to 1 decimal place. So 2 could mean anything from 1.5 to 2.4. And if you add 2.4 plus 2.4, that equals 4.8. So that would look like 2 plus 2 equals 5, aka 2.4 plus 2.4 equals 4.8, which is 5. So yeah, this is kind of normal to have, error in measurements in normal life. So this is this kind of postmodern perspective, which says, does 2 plus 2 actually equal 5? And there are some more kind of aggressive takes here about 2 plus 2 equaling 5 as a part of the, white patriarchal society, which is a little bit more of a hot take, but there's some truth there as well. And on the pushback here, you have some folks who are pushing back to postmodernism. This person says, hey, say no to postmodernism / woke math. And a reminder that, hey, ideas do have consequences. So this guy, James, he, links to this, tweet that we just said, hey, 2 plus 2 kind of equals 5, and he's saying, and then in 2025, well, we're just going to have bridges that are falling because we said, 2 plus 2 equals 5, close enough. This perspective, I think, is, again, kind of reasonable. It probably does too much of a straw man of the other side, but it does say, hey, we need to be very, very serious that, these ideas do have consequences, that there is an underlying truth here. Or as another example, this guy, Eric, says, hey, the point is that mathematicians are able to come almost perfectly close to saying this is wrong, aka 2 plus 2 equals 5 is wrong, in a way that has essentially nothing to do with culture, privilege, power, or anything else. And this makes people angry if they have bet their whole mind on ultra-relativism. So what he's saying here is that, hey, look, math, you can really, really closely say that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is right and that 2 plus 2 equals 5 is wrong. And that has nothing really to do with culture or privilege or power. It's just like 2 plus 2 equals 4, it doesn't equals 5. And if you're someone who's built in this world where you're like, a postmodernist, an ultra-relativist, where you're super plural, everything is constructed and we all have our own realities, whatever, our own lived experiences. That is if you've built your mind on that, then hearing 2 plus 2 equals 5 is wrong and that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is right and that there is a one right answer there, that's difficult to hear if you're an ultra-relativist. So I think this is, again, a reasonable perspective here, and this is like the anti-postmodern perspective that says, hey, y'all, yes, maybe do the postmodern with other stuff, but not with math. And even at the same time, you can see Eric kind of hedging here by saying, well, they're able to come almost perfectly close, so not perfectly close, to saying in a way that has essentially nothing. So a little bit to do with these things. So he's hedging a bit, but there's a little bit that you can hear what he's getting at here. And then Brett says, in response to someone above him, some postmodern person above him, he says, yeah, this seems like sophistry, which means like debating in a way to be, confusing on purpose to make your point. He says, you escape the absoluteness of mathematical identity by requiring physical application towards those pebbles or clouds or whatever, which implies imprecision, which you then stretch into inaccuracy. And just like that, reason becomes discretionary. Who do you suppose wins in that world? So Brett is saying, look, yeah, 2 plus 2 equals 4 generally, and if you're saying 2 plus 2 equals 5 and arguing about it by connecting it, to physical world, well, of course you can't connect this mathematical identity to this physical world here. There's going to be imprecision and inaccuracy, whatever, but you're kind of saying, oh, you're using that as a way to argue for 2 plus 2 equals 5 by connecting it to the physical world. And then by saying that, then reason itself becomes discretionary. It's like, well, okay, 2 plus 2 kind of equals 5. And Brett, And the folks, the people who are worried about postmodernism are like, who do you suppose wins in that world when just anything can be true? And so they're worried about that. So this debate is just, an example of what's happening with postmodernism and metamodernism. This rejection, this modernist truth of the world, especially in science and narratives, this postmodernist pushback to say, let's not believe those things. And, stuff is super socially constructed. And we're seeing this play out today with an example like 2 + 2 = 5. Yeah, so to conclude, modernism says 2 + 2 = 4, definitely the truth. Postmodernism says, 2 + 2 can equal 5, and there are some inherent biases within, 2 + 2 = 4. Metamodernism says, 2 + 2 mostly equals 4. You can start to connect it to let's engage with this relationship here. Also, as a note, you should be very aware of when people are debating in these postmodernist versus, anti-postmodernist ways. That is exactly what we talked about in some of the networkism episodes as an anti-fragile attractor of attention. As you can tell, these folks that are debating 2 + 2 = 4, 2 + 2 = 5, they're sucking all the attention towards them, getting into these little details. Does it equal 4? Does it equal 5? Blah, blah, blah. And how helpful is it? That is a question. I want to conclude this metamodernism section by providing the initial definition of it from Luke Turner, or initial-ish definition of it. This is kind of like an artist guy, and he says, so this is less the science perspective and more the art perspective. He says, metamodernism shall be defined as the mercurial condition between and beyond irony and sincerity, naivete and knowingness, relativism and truth, optimism and doubt, all in pursuit of a plurality of disparate and elusive horizons. So what Luke is saying here is that, metamodernism is this mercurial condition. It's a process, it's a stance, it's an active process between and beyond. It's not just between, but also kind of above. Being ironic. That's, postmodernism is all about irony. Like, whatever, screw the world. But also being sincere, though. What can't we be sincere? Between, naivete and knowingness. Being optimistic, but also being, pessimistic. Between relativism and truth. But is it what is that's what you're just looking at? 2 + 2 = 4. I don't know. Let's be this in this mercurial condition here. So, I think this is a great definition that shows what metamodernism is and feels like. And you can see why it's so connected to coherent pluralism. Now, let's chat about Robert Kegan and stage 5 stuff. This is the idea. This is an adult development framework. And metamodernism, if you think from a multi-scale perspective for the networked human organism, metamodernism and postmodernism is mostly at this at the high level. It's these big cultural trends in culture or in science, while Robert Kegan's stage 5 stuff is all about the individual and how the individual is experiencing these new lenses. And so they map super well onto each other, though. Modernism, postmodernism, and metamodernism are equal to stages 3, 4, and 5 in Kegan's theories. So let's chat about that. So this is what the Kegan theories feel like. It is, for the macro perspective, for the metamodernist perspective, it was at the beginning, we were told modernism. We were given these lenses on reality. We were said, this is true, believe the narratives, believe in science, whatever. Let's rock and roll. Let's do things as a nation state. And then postmodernism said, wait a second. Let's reject that. A lot of this stuff is socially constructed. Let's not just believe what, the presidents are telling us. And then now with metamodernism, we have this nice balance between rejecting the lens, but also embracing the lens, where we can be in relationship to that relationship. And similarly, with Kegan stage 5, these are stage 3, 4, and 5. Stage 3 with Keganism, instead of talking about the macro level, talks about an individual and the lens that you're given as a child. So you are taught as a child by your parents and by your schools, by society. You're socialized, you're programmed to believe certain things about the world. That lying is bad. And then you remove those from as you grow up and move from stage 3 to stage 4, you can look at your lens and you can say, wait a second, is lying actually bad? Maybe it's sometimes good. Or should I, the example I gave in the first video, is being late good or bad? I was taught to be late. Well, maybe being late is less bad. So you kind of see your lens as a lens and reject it. And then stage 5 is about, this pluralistic relationship where you both believe, where you understand your childhood lens, but also have these new lenses that you're putting on and recognizing that everybody else does too. So we're chatting adult development. And these are those 3 stages. Kegan calls them the socialized mind. And he says stage 3 was 58% of the population. These numbers are from the 90s, so I'm not really sure what they are today. Also, don't forget about the replication crisis in psychology. And the socialized mind, that's stage 3. It says you're just in the world, connected to the people around you. And you're like, hey, I am my relationships. I follow the rules. You're very externally validated. And then you move to stage 4, the self-authoring mind, where you say, no, I have this identity. I am a person over here. I don't have this lens. I have an identity. I make choices. Y'all are over there. I'm over here. And then stage 5 is this combination between the two, this self-transforming mind where you say, hey, I hold many identities and I embrace paradox. As a way to show this, I'll do this quote in a second from Kegan, but you can think of the machine of our mind that makes our lenses. And we're like, oh, this is the machine. Or you say, oh, here's something that happened in society. How did that happen? And as we move deeper and deeper towards stage 4 and stage 5, we start to not only see the machines that produce the result, but also the machine that produced the machine. So let's just give this quote to tell you what I'm talking about. So Kegan, in one of his books, says, whereas the machine metaphor forces the stage 3 socialized mind to look at the result or outcome, the effect, and step back to the level of the bigger system that produced it, the cause, the same idea can lead the stage 4 self-authoring mind to look at, take as object, not only the result, but also the machine itself. The machine idea can raise the question of your responsibility, not only for systematically producing the result, but also for producing the machine. So this machine metaphor is part of this company called Bridgewater, which Robert Kegan was interviewing and showing how they were using, stage 3, stage 4, and especially stage 5 stuff. And Bridgewater often asks people in their company, hey, how did the machine produce this result? How did the machine produce it? And as you can see here, sometimes it forces the stage 3 folks to say, whoa, how did, this result was created? How was that created? Oh man, there are these root causes that made it. But then once you get to stage 4, you're like, whoa, you shouldn't just take as object the result, but also take as object the machine itself, so your responsibility for producing the result, but also for producing the machine that produced the result. Cool. So that is stage 5 stuff. And you can see this in people kind of escaping their socialized and programmed childhoods with people who are in cults, essentially. So there's this woman, Megan Phelps Roper, who was in the Westboro Baptist Church, and that's her on the left and right. And on the left, she was born into it, and she was doing bad things with them. She was protesting soldiers' funerals. She was saying, bad things like God hates fags and stuff. She was not great, but she was taught to be that way. And she has this beautiful story about learning and kind of is seeing that reality as her lens. And she was, brought into this by friends on the internet, by a rabbi and a person on Words with Friends who eventually became her husband, that they very slowly and patiently said, hey, let's kind of try to show you other ways of seeing the world. And it was very, very scary for her to take that leap to go from stage 3 to stage 4 and see what she had known as a lens and say, oh God, let's just put that over here for a second and try to see the world in this new way that's really scary and intense, but might be more true. So this is, Megan Phelps Roper kind of she awoke to a new reality. And you can see this in society with terms like woke or red pilling. a lot on the left or in social justice activist circles, you hear woke. Oh, get woke to systemic racism, which is true. Being aware of, our capitalistic, patriarchal, sexist society, that is, it's great to be woke to those systems. And you can hear it on the right too, with people saying red pill. And I don't understand the red pill perspective as much, but they're saying a similar thing, which is understand the world in this deeper way. Take the red pill. And really the way we should imagine it is that you can't just get woke, or you can't just take the red pill. Instead, you're taking this gray pill. Getting woke is essentially getting to stage 4, or, getting red pilled is getting to stage 4, seeing your reality as a lens, and then really going, whoa. Instead, you should take gray pills, which are these repeated things where you continually take the gray pill and try to understand more and more perspectives, and don't just get woke to one of them, but get woke to many perspectives. Okay, and that is, of course, very connected to intersectionality. And so Keegan stage 5 is the individual perspective on metamodernism. And it's all this in this balance of how are we in society understanding this new postmodernism world where there's nothing true, but we can take some things as true. How should we think about that? So metamodernism is one way to think about it. Keegan stage 5 is one way to think about it. And intersectionality provides a cool lens here as well. So intersectionality is this idea that came about after the feminist movement, where in the 1960s, it was amazing. We got a bunch of stuff like Title IX, but it was pretty white. The feminist movement was pretty white. And then, in the 80s, this woman, Kimberly Crenshaw, came up with this idea of intersectionality in 1989. She said, hey, let's not just think of feminism as, you're just your womanhood, but let's think about all these other things, your blackness that comes into it, your disabilities, your sexuality, your nationality. All these things are part of yourself. You're not just a woman or a man. You're not just black or white. You're kind of all these together. You're this Venn diagram of things. And to really explain this so intersectionality is an example of coherent pluralism, where you're trying to be pluralistic and you're also trying to get some coherence. Like, there's only 5 Venn, circles here. There's not infinity. And I want to show a little bit of this with this beautiful slam poet, Taiye Selasi, from this Moses Sumney album called Gray. This is a recent album. And the slam poet just really gets this idea of intersectionality and coherent pluralism well. So the first poem, called Also, and, she says, I insist upon my right to be multiple. Even more so, I insist upon the recognition of my multiplicity. What I no longer do is take pains to explain it or defend it. So I've reached a point where I am aware of my inherent multiplicity, and anyone wishing to meaningfully engage with me or my work must be too. That's super reasonable. We have inherent multiplicity as ourselves. We are these intersectional beings, and we got to, respect each other and engage with each other in that way. Or her other piece here, Boxes, the poem says, I believe that people who define you, control you. The most significant thing that any person can do, especially black women and men, is to think about who gave them their definitions and rewrite those definitions for themselves. So this is a super, Keegan stage 5 perspective, which is, look, you're socialized into this reality with these definitions of who you are. But wait a second, who wrote those definitions? And let's start to rewrite them for yourself here. I think that a great way to understand intersectionality and coherent pluralism is through this abbreviation, or this acronym rather, of how to think about the general queer community. And when it first started, we have this one here of LGBTQ+, where you have lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, queer, and then other plus. And the question from a coherently plural perspective is how many letters should be in this acronym, and who decides? And so as another example here, should it be this one? Should it be LGBTQQIAA? And I think the second Q stands for questioning, the I stands for intersex, the A stands for asexual, and the other A stands for ally. Or should it be LGBTQIAPD, where the P stands for pansexual and the D stands for demisexual? Yeah, I'm not sure. It's tough to say. I think I personally am interested in this top one because it does a great job of being pluralistic, where it doesn't have too many letters. It's like, how many letters do you really want? But it's also pluralistic in that it gets, some of the important / big groups. I'm not sure if that's allowed to say, but and then it adds the plus here, which is like, look, we're mostly talking about these folks, but we're also trying to be inclusive here. We're being pluralistic, but also coherent, and I think the plus really is powerful there. Another example of this that I love is this genderbread person. Genderbread person. And the idea here is that you can think of us as humans all on these various spectrums, these 4 big spectrums. The first is gender identity, which is how do you feel inside yourself? Are you more like a woman or are you more like a man? And for me, I'm kind of more like a man. That's how I kind of identify internally. But then the second question is, how do you express it? Is it super masculine? Is it super feminine? For me, I'm kind of masculine, but not that masculine, but I'm also not that feminine. So how do you express your gender? And again, this could be different. I could feel like a man inside, but then express things in a super feminine way. And then there's a question of just physically speaking, what is your biological sex? Do you have a penis? Do you have a vagina? Do you have some kind of weird combination? That's the females versus maleness. And then finally, who are you attracted to? Are you into, men and males and masculinity? Are you more into the women and females and femininity? And so I think this just gives this is coherent pluralism at its best. It's like, look, there are 4 big categories here. So there's lots, but let's just think about these 4. And then it does this interesting thing where it says for each of them, and I'll switch to the next one here. For each of them, it says, hey, these are all spectrums. And so, it says here, here are 5 of infinite possible, plot and label combos where, let's say for me, I'm mostly straight as far as I know. And so that would look something like, liking women, or maybe you're pansexual, which is where you're kind of game for whatever, and you're pretty interested in it. And that's one where it's on both men and women, you're pretty excited by both. Or maybe you're asexual, and it's something that I moderately also feel myself, where maybe you're into nobody, maybe you're on this spectrum, and you're not as into it as other folks are. Or maybe you're bisexual, which is kind of like pansexual, but it's more it's less. Pansexual is more, aggressive on all the things, and bisexual is, it's more, you're into this, you're into that, but, you can do whatever. So I think this is a brilliant example of coherent pluralism because it gives these 4 big categories, and then within each category it says, hey, are you into this thing or that thing, and how much on that spectrum are you? And to recognize that, hey, here are 5, common combos, saying, look, these are kind of common. So that's okay. There's some commonness, but also there's infinite possibilities here. If you're not on this list, that's cool. You can identify as something else. It might be difficult to get others to understand it, but you get the idea. So this is a great example of coherent pluralism, and LGBTQ+ is another example of this. And the whole space of intersectionality is just really wrangling with some of these ideas of coherence and pluralism around identity. Okay. Now let's chat about something pretty different, which is effective altruism and rationality and how those embody coherent pluralism. So effective altruism is this movement and philosophical mindset of people who are trying to do the most good in the world. So they might think something like, oh, should I give money to my local museum and get more art? Oh, that's kind of helpful, but maybe not crucial, not that big of an impact. Or should I give it to this really, really poor person who's living on less than $2 a day in rural Kenya? That might be more impactful. So that's how effective altruists think. They think about maximizing their impact. And in order to do so, they take this very rational perspective. They are into rationality and understanding, our sense-making systems and how our brains work and making sure we're being as logical as possible. And there's even this thing called CFAR, the Center for Applied Rationality, which is all about this. It's an effective altruist-ish thing, and they say, we're going to teach you how to be rational. And I want to highlight a specific type of rationality that's very coherently plural. And this is this idea of straw manning versus steel manning. So a straw man is when you hear someone's argument and you're like, ugh, and you just portray it in the super weak way. While steel manning is where you try your best to really understand that person's perspective. So for example, we could do this with abortion, which is intense, but I am going to use it as an example. And imagine some kind of pro-life person came to me, someone who was interested in making sure that unborn children were not removed or killed or hurt, whatever, in the womb. And as they're talking with me, I could straw man their perspective and say, well, you want to force women to have children they don't even want, thinking that, and maybe that's not what they said. Am I really hearing them and trying to present their arguments and where they're at in really the best way? Probably not really. Or I could try to steel man their perspective and try to really say their thing in the best way that they feel like, yes, you totally get it. I could say something like, if I understand correctly, you care for all life, including unborn children. Is that right? So you're really trying to steel man and say, oh, this is a great version of your argument. Is this what you're saying? And they're like, yeah, that's it. So this balance is, it's all about, pluralism, trying to really have strong pluralism and really get other people's perspectives. It's, in the effective altruist community, they'd say something like, I might be wrong, or, this is what they call epistemic humility, where you're like, I believe this, but I could be wrong. Where are other people at? Or the reverse of this, which is charitability or being charitable, where you are hearing stuff that other people are saying, say, you might be right. And so this is just to show how effective altruism, which is a powerful new movement, is taking coherent pluralism into account as it's trying to be rational. As another example, let's look at Game B. In Game B, folks, they are mostly into trying to, this big shift that I kind of talk a lot about in these episodes, which is, how are we shifting from our old reality, this Game A, industrial age reality, to this new world of Game B? What is it? Can we create that new world? And Game B folks have a couple ways to express coherent pluralism. They have these rules on their websites, or on especially the Facebook page, where and two of these rules, the most important ones, are rule omega, and then we'll get to this other one of sovereignty, and these both show coherent pluralism. So rule omega says, assume intelligence and build on any coherence you find. And so I like to think of this as something with like signal and noise, where if you're hearing someone and you're hearing all their stuff, and you can choose to not hear it and to just be like, oh, that's a bunch of noise that you're talking about. Or you can just be like, oh, wait, I'm hearing some coherence here. I'm hearing some signal. This is really juicy. Let's build on that. And so you can see how this is being charitable, trying to steel man their position, assuming intelligence. You're really trying to derive the signal from the noise. And this is a rule that they have, a value that they have within their community. The other value they have, they/I, or /we, I kind of feel part of it, is sovereignty. And sovereignty says, I take full responsibility for my own sense-making and decision-making. And again, that's very close to part of coherent pluralism, which says you can't just accept the information ecosystem and just let the fire hose flow over you and say, okay, whatever, it is what it is. No, you have to actively, relentlessly engage with it, search for the good information, take responsibility for your own sense-making and decision-making, because if you're not going to, who's going to? And so this is another part of Game B that's very coherently plural. So those are how those 5 movements embody coherent pluralism. What are other ones? Please let me know in the comments. Okay, we are done for today. What do these movements feel like in your body? I think part of me is scared that I am showing, or that scared whenever you talk about something like intersectionality on the internet, I'm scared of messing up. So I hope I did not. And I'm also, wary in trying to be pluralistic with, something like Keegan's 5 stages. There are a lot of theories of adult development. And it's also replication crisis stuff. And so how true really is it? So I'm a little bit just worried about those things. But I'm also excited that a lot of people are rotating around, are starting to kind of gravitate around some of these important ideas around, and norms and values within their society to be both coherent and plural. And that, it manifests in different ways in different communities, but everybody's circling around the same thing. And I think that's really exciting. And to see that as a shared thing, I also think is really exciting. Also, as a note, again, a reminder, these movements may feel very different in your body than they do in mine. I'm just sharing my own experience. Okay, interactive time. Which movement, most resonates with you? And second, what has your path of adult development been? Again, that's a deeper one and maybe a scarier one, but what are you, a stage 3, a stage 4, a stage 5? Where are you at? Okay, what will it feel like to integrate your learning, and what things should you watch out for? Well, metamodernism and all of these things, but I think especially metamodernism, forces you to zoom out and to constantly be, looking at the relationship between things instead of the things themselves. And that can be pretty disembodied. So as you're thinking in these ways, be sure to get into your body. Second, if you're trying to empathize with everybody, that can in a paradoxical way be dehumanizing. Where you're trying to empathize, you're trying to steel man and really get other people. But by doing that over and over again, it can feel kind of dehumanizing for both you and for the other person. And 3, thinking about your identity as intersectional is incredibly powerful. To see yourself, for me, as a American, rich, especially in the global sense, white, male, straight, cis, all those, that's helpful. And also to think of it as small, to keep your identity small, to not get too wrapped up in it, and to see it as these relationships unfolding. And this is very connected to identity as a process, not a state. If you say, I am an effective altruist, or I am a social justice activist, or whatever, well, then you're kind of, tying yourself to a thing versus, saying, I am into many of the ideas of social justice activism, or I am, thinking of it as a process can be powerful. Similarly, rationality can be powerful, but it can also make you feel a bit like a robot. Trying to steel man the other perspective and making sure you're doing everything right. Oh, do I understand you here? What about this? It can be a bit robotic. And similarly, game B can be powerful, but it can make you too abstract, where you're like, oh, where's the signal? Where's the noise? What, I'm trying to build on your coherence. It's like, what does any of that mean? And then finally, be on the lookout for how movements embody or don't embody coherent pluralism. Both as individuals, where an individual's doing, but also at these bigger, scales. How are movements showing it? As an example here, something like the Democratic Party in the United States, there's always this balance of coherent pluralism within a party, where you have the more extreme folks, the far left, and then you have the more moderates. And so how to be coherent but also plural with those two things. And then, I think, something like the Democratic Party does probably a better job of that. Do they do coherent pluralism with the other side, with the Republicans? Probably not. I mean, the incentives of the whole political system are to not be pluralistic. And, there's some incentives for coherence to actually get things done, to not be a vetocracy, to not just veto things all the time from either side. But most of the incentives are to be one-sided. So that is said. Okay. Thank you again for listening. Hope you're doing well. Hope this was good. Let me know if you have any comments or questions. Goodbye. Oh, and before saying goodbye, don't forget, check out the Root Fellowship, root.co. If you're into coherent pluralism and want to help spread it in society, check us out. It's a good crew working on it. Bye.